And good afternoon to everyone again. Well, I would like to start by saying that I have the opportunity to meet Priscila Riffo in the last IATEFL conference held in Harrogate, UK last April. And I was positively impressed by the topic of her presentation, which addressed the difficulties experienced in enacting inclusive practices in the IELTS mainstream classroom in Chile due to the inclusion legislation of 2016. So now I'm very happy to introduce her and have her sharing her findings with all of us today. Priscila Riffo is an ELT professional with over 10 years of experience in English language teaching and teaching education and teacher education between secondary and higher education in Chile and in the UK. She also has experience teaching academic English in higher education contexts to international undergraduate and postgraduate students. As a language teacher, educator, and researcher, she has developed an interest in pre-service teachers' professional identity formation, understanding that this is as an individual and collectively shaped concept. Mainly, her research is focused on challenges experienced by pre-service teachers when embracing different aspects of their professional identities in the school-based practice and how their personal experiences, beliefs, and trajectories confront national and international language teaching and learning policies. Her research interests also center on mentoring, supervision, and inclusion within English language teaching education. Priscila Riffo is a teaching fellow in TESOL studies at University of Leeds. She's got a doctorate in education from University of Southampton, UK. Is a master's in ELT and applied linguistics from King's College London, UK, and is teacher of English as a foreign language from the Universidad Católica de Temuco, Chile. Our presentation today will be about the practical implications of inclusive practices in the ELT mainstream classroom. So by exploring how EFL pre-service teachers develop their professional identities throughout their last stage practicum in Chile, this talk shows the difficulties experienced in enacting inclusive practices in the ELT mainstream classroom due to the inclusion legislation of 2016. Additionally, it offers practical implications for other ELT classrooms or the training of teachers to promote inclusive practices. So without further ado, let's Priscila give her presentation.
Hi, Claudia, and hi, everyone. Thank you very much for that introduction. And thank you all for being here today. I will start with my presentation now. Give me a second to share the screen. Okay. Okay, you can see that, right? Yes, you can see it?
Yes,
good.
Very clearly, yes.
Great. Awesome. Okay, so Claudia already said everything about me. Today I'm going to talk about some practical implications of inclusive education in the ELT mainstream classroom. My research interests are how pre-service teachers develop their professional identities, and also how English language teachers can be more inclusive. So the outline of the presentation will include the context introduction, kind of theorizing a little bit about inclusion, approaching the concept of disabilities and social justice. Then I will talk a little bit about the research I carried out, my doctoral research. I will present some key ideas of the Chilean inclusion legislation of 2016, or Ley de Inclusión, What I found in the field, some barriers and some facilitators in inclusion in the ELT classroom, implications and conclusion. So it all started in 1994, when more than 92 countries gathered to decide that in the Salamanca Convention that, about inclusive education. This is based in the sustainability goals of the UNESCO, where education should be for all, irrespective of their socioeconomic background, irrespective of where they come from, etc. And in this convention, there were key 4 principles discussed. So this convention provided a framework that established key 4 principles. One is that every child has a fundamental right to education and should be given the opportunity to achieve an acceptable level of learning. And number 2, children possess unique characteristics, interests, abilities, and learning needs. Education systems should account for this diversity. Those with special educational needs should have access to regular schools that can accommodate them within a child-centered pedagogy capable of meeting their needs, and regular schools with an inclusive orientation effectively fight discriminatory attitudes, create welcoming communities, build an inclusive society, and achieve education for all. And I want to be clear that at this point, this was the beginning of theorization of inclusion and integration. So in this framework, we can see that the concept of special needs education is used. This was the trend back then in the 90s. And I will tell you why I decided to use the concept of disabilities in 2023. So before I begin, I would like to ask the participants, what you think inclusion is. Particularly, you can think about the ELT classroom. If you are a practitioner, if you are a policymaker, maybe you have a different view. If you belong to a publishing editorial, what inclusion means to you. So I'd like to read what you think about that. Can you please put your ideas in the chat? What inclusion means? What does it mean to be an inclusive teacher? Okay, to provide learning opportunities to every student, to change our methodology. Okay, that's interesting. Maybe you can further explain that. It means to take into consideration all possible aspects that may affect their learning process. Okay. Oh, yes, I'm going to send, I will share my presentation with you. I think the organizers are going to share the materials with you later. I will also provide a QR code where you can actually access the presentation later. Every student can learn. That's a very nice statement. Thank you very much, Christopher. Equal access to opportunities and resources, providing equal access opportunities for people who may be excluded regarding their physical or intellectual disabilities. Thank you very much, Magarena. Mabel, considering that all our students can learn, it's our job to be aware that they learn at different speed and in different ways to help all our students reach the outcomes. These are very nice ideas. Thank you very much for this. Yes, actually, you are not wrong. And here's what I want to make the distinction between integration and inclusion. In the beginning too, in 1992, we would talk about integrating students. Now we talk more about inclusion. Literature refers to this as inclusion, because integration usually refers to students' physical access to school. So they are in the school, they are part of the school. But it doesn't necessarily mean they are included, because actually integration can lead to a form of exclusion, whereas inclusion encourages engagement from the school community in supporting learning for all. So that would be a big difference. So if you read about inclusion, you are going to find the concept of integration as well, but this can also help you understand what approach this policy, this text is having to inclusion. This then would be how integration looks. Students are in the classroom, they are or in the school community, but they are not being part of it. They are not being part of the community per se. Whereas inclusion would kind of build on relationships. I think inclusion has a lot to do with relationships and create an environment that includes all students. In other words, this is a very popular image, and this is inclusion and integration relate to the concepts of equality and equity. Integration might be more related to equality. So everything, we provide the same to everyone, right? We provide the same activities to everyone, the same time to everyone to learn or to carry out an activity, whereas equity actually addresses that we are all different because we are all different, right? We all have different ways to learn. We all have different ways to understand the world. So with that in mind, you create an environment that promotes equity. And obviously, this has to do with social justice too, right? The sustainable goals from UNESCO are related to promote social justice, education for all. Or in other words, as Braidotti says, we are in this together, but we are not one and the same, right? We are all different. And we can all be in the classroom and we can say, yes, I can be providing, I teach the same to all my students, but maybe we are all different. So we need to consider this when we teach in the classroom. And I know that it can be overwhelming when you have so many students in the classroom or with so many different needs. With this in mind, having provided this background, I'm going to present my research. So my research, the title of my research is The Good Language Teacher, an exploration of how pre-service teachers in Chile develop their professional identity through the practicum. And the overarching question of my research was, what is a good language teacher in the Chilean context as perceived by pre-service teachers? So the focus of my research was pre-service teacher training. And I particularly decided to use the concept of good instead of expert, because my interest was not in how pre-service teachers achieved national standards, let's say, or frameworks for teaching. My interest was on how these pre-service teachers understood what a good language teacher was and how they actually put that into practice in the practicum, in the classroom. This research was carried out, the data was collected in 2019. It was a case study, qualitative, where I studied particularly one English pedagogy program from a university in the south of Chile, in Araucanía, which, by the way, you may know that this is one of the poorest regions in the country, with high number of indigenous population, and where national exams, national standardized exams are always very low. The outcomes of those exams are usually very low in that area. So very deprived area. Out of 20 pre-service teachers, 9 were part of this research. 4 supervisors, which were the supervisors at university, the ones who teacher educators, 5 host teachers who were teachers that were in the school placements that actually received these pre-service teachers, and they let them teach in their classes, but they were not involved in the assessment or training of these future teachers. 2 mentors, and I use particularly the concept of mentors here because they actually received a mentorship training that this university used to provide, but cannot provide anymore because of lack of resources. And these were school teachers who also were supervisors. So they had this dual role. They were supervisors and school teachers. The program leader of that English teaching program and an elite interviewee from the university. Despite my focus is on pre-service teachers, obviously I collected information from all these participants, and they also contributed to a better understanding of what a good language teacher was, where this conceptualization came from, and how it was enacted in the classroom. These pre-service teachers were placed within 5 schools between public and subsidized. And to carry out research, I used semi-structured interviews. I applied semi-structured interviews to all the participants at the beginning of the semester. This was the second semester of 2019. And at the end, I also carried out lesson observation and video recording. And then I did a stimulated recall interview to pre-service teachers. And I did 2 per pre-service teacher, so 1 at the beginning of the practicum and 1 at the end, and a focus group with pre-service teachers at the very end of the process, and also used some documents such as the portfolio structure, such as some of the reflections pre-service teachers wrote about their implementations, such as lesson planning and worksheets, etc. And well, there were many topics that emerged in this exploration of the good language teacher. But one of the topics that caught my attention was that everyone, not only pre-service teachers, raised an issue. They said that they didn't know how to address students with disabilities in the classroom. And again, I am not using special educational needs because according to the social model of disabilities, people are disabled because the world puts barriers. We put barriers because we are an ableist society. So it's not like they are disabled, we disabled them. And also, well, I will tell you very soon about this inclusion legislation and why I'm using the concept of disabilities. One of the pre-service teachers said, this was at the very beginning of the practicum. Probably he had been teaching in a school for maybe 2 weeks. And he already said, I think that I lack some pedagogical knowledge in terms of disabilities. I don't think I have the competencies to deal with the students with disabilities, And now with this inclusion legislation, now I have a student with ASD and others with ADHD, and I don't know how to deal with them. So this student, at the very beginning of the practicum, had already concluded that he could not deal with these students. And this reminds me of some of the cartoons of Michael Giangreco, who talks about the absurdities of disabilities. And it says, despite having a master's and 18 years of experience, Mrs. Snippet tries to convince Mr. Moody that the student with disabilities in her class would be better served by an assistant with no experience. Obviously, this is a very different context. Contexts like the UK or Australia have teaching assistants who are people with they don't need experience whatsoever. In Chile, we have a special educational needs program. So we have actually professionals supporting this. But you will see very soon that it is not always the case that they can support English teaching. But something like this pre-service teacher had studied in his program for 5 years. He's a professional. He was going to be a novice teacher the following year, and he didn't feel prepared to work with a student with disabilities. So what is this famous legislation? This legislation was put into effect in 2016. It aims to provide equal opportunities for quality education to all students, regardless of their abilities, socioeconomic background, or disabilities. Also known as the School Integration Program. And here you can see it says integration, right? Despite this legislation is based on the principles of inclusive education. We still see that integration is being used to conceptualize these students. But at the same time, it stresses the importance of creating a discrimination-free environment for students. And again, this is not only about the students with disabilities, with cognitive or physical disabilities, but it is also about the students who are disadvantaged, students who don't, maybe they don't come from a socioeconomic background that allows them to have so many opportunities in education. And it includes measures such as reasonable adjustments and support for students with disabilities. So what are reasonable adjustments? This legislation and many other policies will say that schools must provide the necessary support and accommodations to ensure that all students, especially those with disabilities or special educational needs, have access to the curriculum and can participate fully in all aspects of school life. And this is kind of a gray area, because when we talk about reasonable adjustments, what reasonable adjustments means to me might not mean the same to you, right? But at the same time, this is kind of giving teachers agency, because it's not telling you what to do particularly, right? And you are the expert in the classroom. You would be expected to know what to do with your students. So what I found in the field, I found some barriers and some facilitators to enact inclusive practices. Some of the barriers were not enacting an inclusive professional identity, because I was exploring how pre-service teachers build their professional identity. When they didn't feel that being inclusive was part of their professional identity, they didn't enact it. They didn't feel it was their responsibility. In this particular classroom, this pre-service teacher had 2 students who were deaf. Luckily enough, these students had each other to communicate through sign language. They didn't interact with other students within the classroom. And even though teacher Christopher, who was the host teacher, told me in the interviews that these students always stayed in the classroom because that was what inclusion meant, at least the 2 times I observed this pre-service teacher implementing her lessons, these students were taken out of the classroom. So at some point in the stimulated recall interview, I asked her, how are you going to address these students? How are you going to make them part of the class? And she says to me, I don't know, teacher Christopher takes them out of the classroom. So it's not my problem, it's not my responsibility. I also would like to stress that most of these schools had high percentage of vulnerable students. Some of them even 90%, 95%. So yes, parents take their pupils to these schools, maybe thinking they will have the opportunity to be part of the classroom, but at the same time, they are physically in the classroom, but they are not being integrated in the community. Another barrier was beliefs against inclusion. After the whole practicum, I carried out this focus group, and I asked all pre-service teachers about their experience and how they managed to teach students with disabilities. And this pre-service teacher says, it was hard for me to work with the students who in Chilean slang are duros de entender. So that means they are slow at learning. So it was difficult because I needed more time to make them work. So in the end, I assigned other students to help them and continued with the class. I had to explain them, these students from the PA program, 5 or 6 times, and they understood. So I used tutors, and that helped. And then we can think, okay, this pre-service teacher is actually using activities that are grounded in the tenets of constructivism. Great. However, what for? Are you interested in these students learning, or is it just You don't want to be in charge of their learning. Why would you think that other classmates could actually teach them better? And I'm not saying that this cannot happen. We know that all the Vygotskian idea of having a more knowledgeable other that doesn't have necessarily to be a teacher, it can be a classmate, that's great. But this student did it because she didn't want to engage in this inclusion. She just felt these students wouldn't understand, so why bother? Again, as I said, inclusion is a broader topic. It's not only about disabilities, cognitive or physical disabilities, but this also has to do with people who have historically been left behind, including LGBT community plus people. And during the data collection, I discovered that there were many students in these 5 placements that were transitioning. They were gender transitioning. One pre-service teacher tells me about this student and how a supervisor who used to teach in this school the previous year, she kind of didn't believe in this kind of inclusion. Although in the interviews, this supervisor told me that inclusion was a moral thing to do, it was an ethical thing to do. But then the pre-service teacher told me, at school, we can call this student by his chosen name, Marcus. But my supervisor told me that she had taught Marcus the previous year and that because of her religious beliefs, she called him Maria, his assigned birth name. And she told me this super proudly. I call her Maria because she understood that I didn't agree with the way she thought. So my supervisor thought that because of what she thought, she could disrespect a human being. And you can see he's not comfortable being addressed as a woman. He dresses like a man, he has short hair, speaks like a man because he wants to be a man. And if you call him Maria, he would obviously feel bad, especially considering all the social pressure and how difficult it must have been for him to embrace his identity. And then that a teacher tells you, no, you are a woman. In this case, this pre-service teacher didn't believe in this. She didn't agree with the supervisor. She really cared about the students in general. And she had really good relationships with the students. And she was shocked that the person that was training her had these ideas. And again, we can believe many things, but we also need to enact the policies. And again, policies in the end are what people enact. That's why we really need to understand what we are doing. And this, I think this is very critical considering there are so many people from the LGBT community plus who go through bullying. Some of them decide even to end their lives because life can be so hard for them. So as teachers, we need to consider what we say and how we include these students. And at some point, another pre-service teacher told me, I didn't even know which bathrooms can trans students use. And this was not discussed. She asked in the staff room and no one knew. As you know, we have the gender identity legislation in Chile as well, and people can actually use the name they feel more comfortable with, irrespective of their biological gender. But this was not being respected. Another barrier was lack of support and training. This was something voiced by all the participants. All the participants said, we don't have any support from the disabilities staff because the support goes to maths and Spanish language subjects. And again, when this legislation was enacted, this program didn't have a component, a module, let's say, that was focused on inclusion. They did know about the legislation, but they didn't know how to do some practical activities regarding this legislation. And same for special educational needs programs. They were trained to focus on maths and Spanish language, which coincidentally, if you want to call it, these subjects are the subjects that are assessed nationally and that schools depend on to get more funding from the state. So how inclusive is this actually? Even though the disabilities staff was usually very helpful in trying to support with what they knew, most of the advice was focused on the assessment, not in the learning process. Well, to end on a positive note, there were also some facilitators. And the overarching facilitator here was reflection. When there was reflection, pre-service teachers, school communities actually enacted inclusion. One pre-service teacher told me, I know I can't demand a disabled student to perform as well as students who sit at the front, whose parents care for them. More than assessing with a unique criteria, in this case, I have to consider other aspects, other factors that impact the student's learning. And the family factor is super important. Because in this practicum, pre-service teachers actually are involved with parents. They see which parents go to the meetings, and they notice which parents are usually asking about their pupils. But here she kind of points out that, yes, I have to consider other aspects. Maybe a student who didn't have a proper breakfast in the morning, maybe a student who saw something tough at home, a fight between their parents, or so many different situations that they go through. They cannot go into the classroom and say, okay, now I'm going to learn English and I'm going to learn how to go shopping, right? This student needs some support, and maybe the school is the safest place for them. And maybe it's not our role as teachers per se, but probably we are going to be the ones who are going to offer that safe space for them. So we need to consider that too. Reflection about the context again. This host teacher, for example, they didn't have any support in the last 2 years of secondary education. They didn't have any support from the disabilities staff. It ended in year 10 or second high. So she said, we adapt the assessments. In this case, the adaptations are very simple. For instance, if a test has 2 reading texts, then you put 2 reading texts, but of shorter length. The quantity and level of difficulty change, but the objectives are the same. So again, when there is a will, there is a way, right? I do the reasonable adjustments. Maybe I don't have the support, and I do it. In other cases, some pre-service teachers did have support, but they still didn't engage with inclusive practices. Another facilitator was reflecting on enacting inclusive practices. This pre-service teacher says, shying away and saying the university didn't prepare us is the easiest thing to do. And taking content out or lowering the test standards for them is not effective for students' learning. In the end, the inclusion legislation becomes the exclusion legislation. Students don't review all the contents, they are left behind. Again, are we integrating? Are we including? It can be difficult, right? But if you believe that your professional identity includes being inclusive, you will do it. If you believe it's not your responsibility, I'm there just to teach English. What do I have to do with this? Then it's going to be more difficult. And something else is that everywhere where pre-service teachers saw that the staff, the English teachers, the community engaged with inclusive practices, they followed. So it is really important when we are training future teachers to show them that it is possible to do it. This mentor, she was a very experienced mentor. She had taught for more than 20 years in that school, a very underprivileged school. Actually, this was kind of a rural area with high number of indigenous population. And she had 2 pre-service teachers there. She said, I told pre-service teachers to interview the disabilities staff and get some suggestions on how to adapt the material for students, from lowering the level of demand from these students to adapting activities. And they achieved good results. I also suggested them to monitor these students more by paying more attention to them and maybe find a student who can support them. But the point is that to be inclusive, we don't have to take the students with disabilities out of the classroom. Otherwise, we're not including. The idea is that no one notices this. It is not to put a tag on the students with disabilities. Here, there was a student with a permanent disability who got involved completely in Susan's lesson. Susan was a pre-service teacher. And that increased the students' self-esteem as well. Again, if this will not only reflect on the English subject, it will also reflect on other subjects and probably in that student's life and self-esteem in general. By the way, I'd like to say that all these names are fictional. All the participants have been anonymized. These are not their real names. But yes, so again, if they were encouraged by the mentors, by the host teacher, by the supervisor, or if they saw that others had inclusive practices, they would do it. When they didn't see it, they completely forgot about it. And again, then we wonder why these students feel like an island in the mainstream, right? Do we want them to feel integrated again, or do we want them to feel included? Implications. Students with disabilities might not learn English, but not because of their disabilities, but because they are not included. Therefore, not provided the opportunities to learn in the ELT classroom, right? To be an inclusive language teacher, caring is important. We need to care, and maybe some of you might disagree, but in the Chilean context, in deprived context, it is important that you show that you care about the students. Before teaching, you need to know who they are. You need to relate with them. And to enact inclusive practices, reflection is needed. It is needed because we need to, all contexts can vary. And even if we have worked in a school for many years, then we move to another school and everything is different. So we need to be constantly reflecting on our practices. How to care? Caring by including students in the learning process, not only in the assessment. I would say this is something I observed. It was very common. Students don't want to be only assessed differently. They want to be part of a community, right? Supportive, but not hovering, right? You don't have to be stuck on the student all the time. Or say, oh, you sit here because you distract easily, right? Put a tag on the students. We don't have to do that. Identifying students as complete human beings, just different. We are all different in the end, right? So let's keep that in mind. And this is something to think about. Time was a constraint. I understand. We are busy. We need to comply with a curriculum. We need to teach certain contents, right? And sometimes policies, planning, yearly planning, weekly planning doesn't understand this. Okay, and these authors, Thomas and Whitmore, say antagonism that undermine the development of inclusion across education draw upon superficial identity categories that combine both the imposition of accountability with the standards on a school and teacher training programs. It seems like with these things, we always have to be somewhere. We need to be doing something at a certain time of the year. But maybe we just need to slow it down a little bit and try to comply with that at the same time, because I know in a school we need to do that, but at the same time including these students. And Akbari, in one of Grace and Bloch's books, says that ELT, international academic discourse, seems not to be aware of other teachers' precarious working conditions. Therefore, these results support that adopting or not certain identities, such as an inclusive identity, as a teacher is related to social class. If I am a teacher and I am the breadwinner of my family, and I am teaching 50, 60 hours a week, obviously it is going to be difficult to enact an inclusive identity. But what I'm trying to say here is that you don't have to do much. I think that when students realize that you genuinely care for them, things change in the classroom. The way you relate to them changes in the classroom. Maybe they won't like English, but they will like you, so they would want to learn English. Another implication is that beliefs against inclusion were the ones that impacted the more on pre-service teachers engaging with an inclusive ELT professional identity. Oh, sorry, you cannot see this. But Pajares talks about beliefs, also Archango Barahona. And Finardi wrote a paper about Latin America and how beliefs actually play such a big role on what we enact, what we don't enact. So people can say, yeah, we have tried that. I believe philosophically on this. I remember there was a pre-service teacher who said, I believe in inclusion, but in social inclusion, not in students with disabilities being in the classroom. And if a classroom is not social inclusion, what is it then? So exclusion plus excuses become excuses. We don't want to make excuses, right? We are professionals. We are the experts. And the last conclusion would be that to be an inclusive language teacher, caring and knowing students are important. Reflection that leads to action is needed. The good language teacher, and this is my personal conclusion after carrying out this research, to be a good language teacher, you need to be an inclusive language teacher. We need to be inclusive language teachers. And also regarding the current national ELT policy, I suggest that framing the teaching of English within a more local and contextualized pedagogy could benefit its understanding and implementation in the private and underprivileged contexts. These are my references, and thank you very much for your attention. Here you have my contacts, and if you scan this QR code, you are going to be able to see the slides of this presentation. And also you can access other materials. Thank you very much. Sorry, I was just reading one of the comments. Claudia, you are muted.
Okay. Thank you very much for your incredible presentation, Priscila. This is quite a relevant topic, and having done your research in our Chilean situation is a huge contribution to understanding the challenges English teaching faces towards implementing the reasonable adjustments requested by the Inclusion Chilean legislation. And your experience on this is, I mean, it's pivotal because we somehow get prompts from other countries and other experiences, and being you doing the research with how difficult it is to implement it and all the preconceptions that we have in our teaching and towards the students is absolutely clarifying, because this is evidently the reality of our teaching environment in Chile. So thank you very much.
Thank you,
There is
Claudia.
a question here in Daniela Guerra from our university says, Priscila, what do you think is the best way to recognize and incorporate the needs for all learners in order to make informed decisions before planning our lessons?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much again, Claudia, for your comments, and thank you very much for the ones who are here today. It's been a pleasure, and I understand all the constraints that being inclusive all the constraints we can have as ELT teachers. Thank you, Daniela, for your question. I think that it really depends, right? It depends on the school and the resources that you have. When I worked in schools in Chile, I worked in the private sector and also in subsidized schools, and I can see there's a huge difference, right? Sometimes in the private system, you have all the support. Now in the public and subsidized, you will also have it, although it can be slow, right? But I think that if you identify that maybe a student is not, for example, hearing well, or if a student is not seeing well, I think there are many things that with your expertise as a teacher, you will identify on your own. But if you require further assistance, it is important to ask the specialists at school. At the same time, I would say one of the best things you can do is to talk to that student, obviously in private, and say, what works for you? Tell me what works for you. Actually, I will have a student with a attentional deficit in one of my modules, and I received a letter with all the indications and all the suggested things I could do, but I really would like to have a conversation in private with that person. And and ask that person what I can do to best support her learning, because I think that's the person who can actually tell you. Then now you ask, how can we ensure that adjustments to assessments do not affect their own perception of the quality of the instrument? I mean, being able to ensure that they are assessed without them feeling that everything has been made easier for them. Yes, this happens a lot, right? But again, maybe you can ask for a different type of assessment. You can do a different type of assessment. It doesn't necessarily have to be a written assessment. If it is, I don't know, if they are doing some reading comprehension, I have sometimes asked students to make a drawing of what they understood, and some of the drawings can be really nice. Some of these students can be really creative, right? So let's try to use their skills and what works best. I hope I answered your question, Daniela. You can email me if you want more answers. I would like to say something that I saw in the chat, if I may, Claudia.
Go ahead. There is something in the chat from Catherine Kinton.
Yes, she says, just a comment to add, I am British and work in a Chilean school, and I really agree and understand what you are saying in this webinar. I usually get comments from Chilean teachers saying that I can't differentiate or adapt activities because the parents will complain why they are not doing the same work, or students will notice they are doing something different. I believe that the teachers don't have the abilities to comfort the parents because they believe they will not understand. Okay, that's a really, really interesting point. I think when I ask students, why don't you differentiate the activities? They told me, no, because it has to be the same for everyone. They will feel bad. But it doesn't necessarily mean lowering down, right? For example, if you have a reading text, you can provide the students with maybe 3 different texts, right? Of the same topic, let's say, with different levels of difficulty. And you can tell, okay, why don't you read the first text? And then maybe I'm going to challenge you. Maybe if you can read the second, you can read the second text. Maybe you understand the third text. So maybe those students whose English is better, they will obviously read the third text, and maybe the others will keep with the first one, but the comprehension activities or whatever you want to carry out in the lesson will be the same. I think that it's not only about saying, as I said before, okay, you sit here, or I am going to give you this, I'm going to dumb down this activity for you. You can also challenge other students, because we have different students with different levels of English, with different interests, right? But I really understand that parents sometimes can complain, and parents sometimes don't want their students to be assessed differently too. That's a problem as well. Macarena says, it really works when you ask your students in advance what are their needs, what is their pronoun. I do that by creating a Google form at the beginning of the term. Yeah, that's a really good idea, actually. That's a really good idea. Yes. Yeah, I don't know if there are any other questions.
It doesn't seem to be more questions, but it's been very interesting, the feedback, and yeah, it says here we all need to learn more about the topic. Thank you very much. Yes, I think it's been a great contribution, and it's something that we are all interested in getting more information. And what you have done is you have transferred to us the responsibility of addressing the situation in the classroom. What you have mentioned is to give the teacher the responsibility of adapting the program to the students in order to include them in a group and in the learning process. There's another question here. No, thank you. Okay, that's it.
Yes, yeah. Exactly. Because we are the experts, right? We are professionals. So, and you know your class best. I'm not going to tell you this is the best you can do, because you know your students. And I think the more agency we have, the better decisions we can make in the classroom, certainly.
Okay. But sharing experiences, it's important in order to feel confident that we are somehow adapting a reality and maybe taking other teachers' experience and implementing that into our own teaching activity, and also sharing with our team and our teachers is essential, is crucial. That's why this conference is so important, I think, because it gives us tips and motivates us to do things better and implement changes in the classroom. So I think it's been very, very, very good having you again, Priscila, with us today. And if there are no more questions, I would just say thank you very much. I hope are you planning to come back to Chile?
At some point, yes. At some point, yes. But well, thank you, everyone.
Where are you at the moment, Priscila?
So I am moving to Leeds very soon.
Mm-hmm.
I am currently in Southampton still, but I'm moving to Leeds. But yes, I have to go back to Chile, and I would love to make connections with people in Chile because I am interested in developing these ideas further, hearing about practitioners' experiences, but also other people, policymakers, people who are in the publishing industry. I really would like us to create a community and discuss about these things, because as you say, yeah, obviously we learned from each other. So let's keep in touch, and I would love to hear some of your experiences. Thank you very much. And thank you, Claudia, for having me.
Yes, absolutely. I'm very proud of having you today, sharing your experience, Priscila, and having had the chance to meet you in IATEFL in April. Yes. I feel proud that the Chilean teacher is doing something that could favor our teaching, the English language teaching here in Chile. Thank you, Priscila.
Thank you very much.
And for the audience, we will have a break, a kind of 20 or 25 minutes break. So the next presentation is going to be at 4:10. We will be having Michelle Marie Molanphy presenting at that time. So enjoy your coffee, enjoy your break. Thank you very much.